I just want to thank you all for coming through the snow to class today. And you didn't even know that you were sacrificing an excellent lecture by Dr. Von Sievers to hear your TA give her practice lesson. We're going to do the class in a very different format, but I know you still want some good meat for your notes. And so the 4 questions that I want you to concentrate are up here. And these, as we go through, you're going to have to synthesize the material to be able to answer these questions. Why did the Ottomans provoke this war? What was in it for them? Why were the Habsburgs vulnerable? Why were the Turks defeated? Now I say Turks, but the Ottomans were also Armenians, Syrians, Macedonians. So realize that every time we say Turks. And what changed because of the summer of 1683? So those are the 4 questions at the end of the class that I hope you be able to carry away with you. Those of you that I've given speaking parts, we have to work with the camera. And so if you don't have a very projecting voice, when your part comes, or the part before you actually, come to the front and speak into the speaker so that it's captured for eternity on the next program that'll be happening with this class. And I want to thank you all for being willing to do these parts. Just speak with passion. Know that everybody else is also seeing their part for the very first time, but just bring out the inner thespian within you. Thank you so much for being willing to do this, to make it fun. To help the rest of you who've come late to know a little bit how our room is organized, this corner and row over here are our Turkish invading army. And you here are the Habsburgs sitting in the city of Vienna. And my goal for this class, besides the answer to these 4 questions, is that you can feel what it was like to either be a soldier in the 17th century or to be inside a city that was being besieged. So I hope you're able to carry that away. Reform can destroy you. If you don't reform, you fall apart, you crumble. But if you do reform and you return to your former strength, then you feel that you have to again pursue the original goal that caused you to need reform in the first place. Now, last class, those you gallant warriors who made it through the snow, we learned about the Korporlu viziers who had been so successful in consolidating and reforming Ottoman Europe, the Ottoman Empire. By stabilizing the monetary system, they went back to silver coins instead of those debased ones, and they hired mercenaries to make the military effective again. They had restored strength to the Ottoman Empire. But the big question, would the Ottomans use that strength to go back to their original goal of conquest, jihad? Would they re-energize their attack machine? Well, the siege of 1683, the year that changed everything. The year before, 1682, who were the power brokers? What were the reasons? What were the decisions made? Our first candidate is the Sultan, Mehmed IV, who had been on the throne since age 6. He was now 43, but he was the product of the harem. He had little or no political or military training. He had stayed on the throne through the machinations of his own mother, who fought his grandmother, and some people say killed her, was responsible for killing her, because she wanted to replace Mehmed with another grandson who would be had a mother who would be more compliant. His goals were to survive childhood, go hunting as often as possible, and to live to a ripe old age. The real power lay in the hands of his mother, who collaborated closely with the powerful Grand Vizier Kara Mustafa. He was an adopted son of that Korporlu Vizier family. The Grand Vizier, Kara Mustafa, is the ultimate bad guy in our story. He wanted a war for his own political gain. He had lost out badly to the Russians, and a new war would enhance his grip on power. It would unify the Muslims, and it would push all those idle, troublemaking Janissaries out of the capital, not to mention Lut and his first choice of captured girls for his harem. Besides all these internal motivations, the Grand Vizier knew from his spies that his northern neighbors, the Habsburgs, were busy with France. The Ottomans also had another window of opportunity offered by the relative success of their Hungarian vassals. The nobleman Imre Tolaki, who was leading the Hungarian nobles in a Protestant, Lutheran, anti-Habsburg rebellion. This handsome young man had his father killed by the Habsburg. There was no love lost between them. He could offer the Ottomans some home court advantage. He was seen as the key to combat intelligence, the key to logistics, and he could pacify the local population in Hungary and Austria. A war would deal with the Habsburg meddling in Transylvania and Wallachia, now Romania. The Grand Vizier, then knowing his own need for an outside conflict to get back his prestige, and knowing that the Habsburg were militarily weak due to France and this Protestant rebellion, chose 1682 to provoke a crisis as an excuse for an invasion. Why did the Habsburgs desperately not want war? The Habsburgs, left by Leopold, would buy peace at almost any price from the Ottomans because they always believed that Louis XIV in France was their greatest threat. The Ottoman army had not been at the gates of Vienna for 150 years, but France was even then encroaching on Flanders, Germany, and Italy that the German princes felt belonged to them. Further concessions to France would be fatal to Habsburg power and reputation, while concessions to the Sultan Mehmed IV could later be retrieved. The Habsburg diplomatic strategy was to drag out negotiations with Muslims, maybe handle a fortress or two as concessions on the border, and thereby allow them to keep the main part of their army in the west to oppose Louis XIV in France. The Ottomans had been no more than pesky mosquitoes raiding on the borders for a long time, and Leopold held his breath that that would not change. But things had changed. 1681 had marked the end of a dismal 3-year war with the Russian Cossacks that had been lost to the Ottomans, and the Grand Vizier needed a new project to keep the troops busy and to improve his reputation. He convinced the Sultan to give orders for the army to gather and march north. 1683. The Ottoman military had to move 100,000 people on foot to the northern battlefields. They were moving from Istanbul all the way up to Vienna. They also were bringing troops in as far as Mesopotamia, Aleppo, Egypt, Thessaly, and those troops had even further to walk. We have eyewitness accounts of this march across the cold, wet Balkan spring by the secretary of Kapadar, who was the Habsburg diplomat to the Sultan. Sir, could you tell us what it was like? Yeah.
April 1683, on the road to Belgrade. I am secretary to Emperor Leopold's diplomat. We are being brought along on this trek as privileged captives in case we may provide useful to the Grand Vizier. Some of the army marches or rides forward by day, but when I try to sleep at night, I am woken by the noise of other troops advancing through the darkness by the flare of countless torches. Carts and wagons of every description follow the various detachments unless they are lost or lagging behind. Great flocks of sheep and herds of cattle are driven along. I am estimating that 32,000 pounds of meat and 60,000 loaves of bread are consumed every day. Privileged persons go by coach which stick in the mud. The rains are shocking. Most men are sleeping in tents while the exalted sometimes find accommodation in hospices along the road. The Janissaries are the indispensable vanguard going ahead leading the way, marking out distances and preparing ovens every evening for those following them.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It wasn't just mud slowing down this army moving across the land, but the knowledge that the bridges ahead of them had not been repaired as quickly as the Grand Vizier had ordered. They had to cross the swamps of Hungary and tributaries of the Danube, and the rains had swollen all the streams. Other troops were joining them daily: Albania, Thessaloniki, Egypt, Aleppo, Mesopotamia, and the vassals of Hungary. Only the 8,000 Tatars coming from the Ukraine were not slowed down. Now, Tatars are one of the Turkic tribes that had moved west with the Mongolian invasion and never gone home. They preferred to cross the steppes while the ground was still frozen, and they didn't need the bridges. They just tied their prisoners to the tails of the horses and forded the streams, arriving a month ahead of the army. They used that time to soften up the enemy by pillaging the Austrian countryside. Now, both Poland and Austria knew that the Turks could attack anywhere on the 12,000-mile-long border. Jan Sobieski, King of Poland, was officially an ally of Louis in France, but he had no illusions that if Austria were hit first by the Muslims, that he would be the next domino to fall. He did not know that the French ambassador to the Sultan knew that if he attacked Poland, the French would come to the assistance of their allies. But the French diplomat made clear to the Sultan that it was open season on their enemies, the Habsburgs. With the October 1682 report of the Ottomans gathering a huge army and heading north, the Poles and the Habsburg dropped their differences and signed a mutual protection treaty. Because Vienna had, this is Jan Sobieski and Leopold who signed that treaty. Because Vienna had not been attacked for a long time, its defenses had decayed. The moat no longer held water, the timbers were rotted, suburbs and garden walls had been built up outside the city walls and would provide cover for the attacking army. The population had been decimated by the plagues of 1679 and 80, which reduced the defense force. Still, Leopold had been able to double his forces and tax revenues for the last 2 years, without which everything would have been different. Austria would have approximately 30,000 men now to fight off the 100,000 men in the Ottoman army. But perhaps more critical, the Habsburg were lacking military leadership. The Emperor Leopold knew that he was not the warrior that his father, Ferdinand, whom we saw on a slide several weeks ago, had been, and he preferred to hand over the military command to a general. That decision to stay off the battlefield was his positive trait. His weak point was a lifelong inability to make a decision. The general he chose had that same inability to make a decision. The new head of the army, Charles V, the Duke of Lorraine, had only seen one war 20 years earlier and was frequently sick.
I just cannot decide which fortress to hold to stop the Ottomans. The scouts give me different reports, and the distances between the forts are much greater than I expected. When I do try to give orders, the other nobles here argue and have a different opinion of where we should hold the line. No one really agrees what we should do to stop these invaders.
The decision was not needed because the Turks just skipped attacking the fortresses on the border